There's some people still coming in, but I would first like to say hi to everyone and welcome to the second webinar in the series Beyond Plant Blindness, Understanding and Protecting Native Biodiversity, which is organised by the EXPBIO-Project. My name is Helen Ekvall. I work at Gothenburg Botanical Garden in Sweden and am a PhD student at the University of Gothenburg. Also with me is Gunilla, who is the project leader for EXPBIO and today is my technical support. The EXPBIO project is funded by the EU Interreg North Sea programme. We are 8 partners from Sweden, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium. We are municipalities, universities, botanical gardens, public research institutes and governmental agencies. Our aim is to increase plant biodiversity in the North Sea region and raise awareness of its importance. I'm delighted to see many of you here today who are interested in exploring practical and scientific approaches to raise plant awareness and increase engagement in the natural world. When we don't understand ecosystems and the roles that plants play in them, we may overlook the life forms we depend on. We cannot protect what we don't know, recognise or value. Last spring, we held a series of webinars on seed mixtures and seed cultivation, followed by a second webinar series last autumn focusing on grassland restoration. This third and last series will focus on 5 speakers who share their latest insights on how we can engage people in plant diversity and increase plant and biodiversity awareness, and also show how plants and wildlife can relieve stress. Last week, we listened to an inspiring talk by Peter Pani from the University of Vienna about how the scientific understanding of human-plants relationships have evolved. Today, I'm very pleased that Anton and Oriol are here to hold a talk about nature connectedness, and I'm sure we will learn a lot from their experiences. Professor Anton Stahl Olafsson and Oriol Garcia Antunez, who's a postdoc, are from the University of Copenhagen, and they are social ecological researchers working with urban sustainability, human-nature relationships, nature connectedness, and nature values. This webinar will last about 1 hour, 30 to 40 minutes for the presentation and the rest of the time for discussions. Some technical issues. We ask you to please mute your microphone and please write your questions in the chat during the talk, and we'll have a discussion with these questions after the talk. With that, I hand over to you both, Anton and Oriol.
Thanks a lot, Helen, and thanks for the introduction. And also, thanks for allowing us to be here, including. We will start by sharing our screen. So now you all will see the first slide in our talk here. Yes, thanks for all the nice words indeed. And I would say, I mean, the whole topic around plant blindness is definitely something that both Oriol and I have close to our hearts and also minds to some extent. However, this talk that we have been asked to provide today is perhaps a little bit more overarching talk around reconnecting people and nature in this urban world that we're living in today. But of course, people-plant relationships are also key here in many ways. So please bear that in mind. So the plan and program for the next lecture here, the next 45 hours or so, is that I will start off with a kind of overall introduction, and then Oriol will take over and provide some insights in 2 new studies that Oriol have been leading from us that we think is very relevant to this theme here. So one study about what do we need to do or what motivate people to engage in wildlife-friendly gardening. And then a third study on pro-environmental attitudes and how can our childhood nature experiences perhaps help explaining, understanding the pro-environmental attitudes we might have in our as adults, pretty much. But I will tell you a lot more about that later. So let's get started with the introduction here to human-nature relationships in current times. Well, there's many ways you could start such a talk. Maybe one way could be to show two images like this that I think everybody here have seen similar versions of, at least. So the one to the left, of course, is the kind of detrimental or disconnection, or the way we pretty much are destroying the planet that we depend on. And we all know that story clearly. But that is also very true, of course, and it's taking place. But we also see an increasingly awareness and awakening a little bit about different new ideas around care and interrelationship between people and nature as kind of solutions into all these transitions and transformations of our societies that are needed in this time we're living in. And it's actually these two different images on the Anthropocene somehow that we want to like to tap into with today's talk. We take the departure in the urban, and there's many ways we can try to understand and explain what is happening with the urbanization of our planet and the urban growth and the urban population shares, etc. But one way perhaps to understand this is this so-called Great Urban Acceleration that we worked with in a paper a few years ago. And the idea here clearly is that we see this acceleration pattern across both the social, the ecological, and the technological dimensions or spheres in a lot of different numbers. And here are some examples, of course, with the urban population increase, the urban economy, the social part, global water usage, ecological, we have the biosphere degradation, the surface temperature, the carbon dioxide. Technologically, there's the crude steel production, global cement production, etc. We all see this kind of accelerating trends in the past hundreds of years that we have witnessed during this great urban acceleration. And that, of course, comes with a lot of challenges, and we all aware of that. And one way we have tried to address this is with working with a kind of interlinked understanding of these social systems, ecological systems, and technological systems in this SETS perspective, so social, ecological, technological systems perspective. So we have to look into all these interactions in order to really understand this rather complex system, actually, to address transformations and transitions that are needed for a better future, pretty much. So this increased urbanization is also leading to perhaps what we could can call an increased mental urbanization, the extent to where we feel disconnected from nature. And that can come in many, many different forms. And a few years ago, we did this paper here where we tried to argue for disconnection from nature, of course, being at an individual level, but actually also a societal level, where we can see a lot of societal processes also contributing to these processes of disconnection that we witness. Out there in the cloud, in the end, we have a lot of terms from the literature where different researchers are working with these themes, these different types of disconnection themes. And indeed, this is also very complex and interlinked between individual and societal. Colleagues here from France and other countries have developed this figure that we think is kind of nice and that we would like to introduce for you guys here today, and then also we'll come back to in the very end. So This group of researchers, they did a big literature review, global meta-analysis into all sort of studies into this theme of human nature connections. And the idea, of course, is that we have to go from this detrimental vision that we might see today, to some extent at least, the extinction of experience that could be through plant blindness, that might lead to or be interrelated with the human nature disconnection. You see people, man, here at the top of the pyramid, right? Leading to an anthropocentric view of nature, which might again also relate with unsustainable norms and values and behaviors and policies that might again increase the extinction of experience. And then we have this kind of detrimental vision going on. So how can we come from here to a more sustainable vision, where we have contact with nature as a starting point a little bit, by greening our cities, by being exposed to outdoor nature and nature experiences that might then relate to a more non-anthropocentric or ecocentric view of nature, where we see nature more as equal in a way, right? And then again, that might relate to more sustainable norms and values and behaviors and policies, and then we have a positive loop going on. And this is actually some of the research that Oriol would like to present for you in a minute or so, where we're trying to tap into these dynamics. And I would say that this is, of course, a nice drawing, and that sounds very easy. And of course, it's not. But I would also say that this is taken from a big meta-analysis, which is pretty much the strongest thing we have in research, actually. So these researchers have looked across 134 different studies and taken them to pull them together, and then have looked into the explanatory power between each of these studies to show these different types of correlation here that they have drawn like this in the model. So there is actually research behind this, and that's the positive news, I suppose, for today in a way. Realities. Now we are in Denmark. We're sitting in the University of Copenhagen. How is it looking here? Well, we've just done a kind of national update on our national accounts of how Danes are using nature, visiting nature. And here are just some crude numbers of the development trends over the past 30 years. And it looks kind of promising that there's been 110 million visits to nature annually in 1994. Today it's 133. But when we control for population growth, the numbers are pretty much the same. So actually, we don't have a kind of extinction of nature experiences going on in Denmark, I would say. But it seems to be kind of stable, more or less. But the way we use nature perhaps have changed. And it tends to be today that urban nature is a lot more important than this kind of more rural nature in the way we use and connect with nature. This is just an example of different types of nature types. This is in Danish. It's not super important, but you can see different types of landscape with millions of visits yearly here. I will leave that for another talk. And as I said, the urban fringe, the everyday nature have become more important. This is just an example where we have asked participants in Denmark to map the latest nature visit. We have around 10,000 visits across the country that are representative to the total population. And you can see when we ask people doing that, they actually point to a lot of urban areas here around the city of Silkeborg in Jutland. And it tends to be that actually 80% of the visitations in Denmark are within 2 kilometers of the Danish cities, which really puts a lot of focus on this peri-urban nature. It's actually critical to the population's outdoor recreation and nature visitation. And on top of it, we also have measured now that nearly 50% of these nature visits actually happened on the only 10% of the public land that are owned by the state or municipality in a Danish context. What about the greening of cities then? The whole idea about bringing nature closer to people by greening, renaturing our cities. And there's of course a lot of good arguments for why we should do this. This is just some of them taken from a new UN policy brief here on the benefits of urban and peri-urban forestry. And I think a lot of you listening in know about all these good arguments here. But what are then the realities? Well, when we look into Copenhagen, we can find these kind of benchmarks here between different European capitals done by the European Environmental Agency. where they have measured the total green infrastructure in cities, the urban tree cover, and the green space, and what are the percentage share that these types of ecosystems are distributed with over the entire city. And here we actually find Copenhagen. Oops, sorry, the arrow is a bit off here. I don't know what happened. Never mind. But that's in the lower bottom tree. So Copenhagen, has a total green infrastructure about 30%, urban tree cover of 60%, and urban green space of cover of 10%, which is actually relatively low compared to many other European cities, particularly what you might find in northern Scandinavia. I know there's a listening in from Sweden and Norway and Finland, for instance. So 75% of the capital cities in Europe are actually biophysically greener than Copenhagen. So we definitely have something to work with here where we are based today here. Then a lot of this is around nature connectedness, and we have done this measure on the Danish population score on nature connectedness. And here you see a image of this from the Danish population from the age 15 to 83. And here's the score up here. And then we have with orange men and with blue women. And when we look into this charts, we see similar charts from UK, from a lot of Netherlands, from other countries that have done that. It looks pretty much the same all over. We see women are generally higher in their score around nature connectedness. And we also see this kind of nature teenage dip happening in the teenage years, where teenagers actually are scoring very low. Not so much women, but definitely teenage boys or men. And then we also see large deviations between the younger and the older groups here, also in this chart in many different ways. And the way we have worked with this score is that people have replied to questions like this, that then are used to calculate this score pretty much, which, a kind of regular scale to measure nature connectedness with. Okay, take home messages for now before I give the word to Oriol. I hope you have a little bit of an idea about how important the urban everyday context is to our nature experiences and also our possibilities to reconnect. We see these numbers of 80% of nature visits in Denmark, for instance, are within the 2 kilometers from cities. But of course, that said, we should not forget the more rural and remote nature, which is also central to our whole understandings around nature values. And Oriol will also come a little bit back to that. So these experiences and ideas and understandings of wild nature, scenic beauty, peace and tranquility are actually quite important also in also framing the experiences in our urban context. Our view and connection to nature are diverse. And of course, this diversity can be based on many different needs, reasons, and preferences. And we also think that it's very important that we embrace this diversity in the work with transformative changes and green transitions. We have a giant task ahead, paving the way for an improved connection between people and nature, for both the health of the planet and ourselves. Now the word over to Oriol, please.
Yep, thank you, Anton. Yeah, Anton has now presented an introduction of also what the status of nature connection is in Denmark. And we have, when we talk about human nature connection and nature connectedness in general, I think there's many different reasons why we should be talking about. One of them is obviously the clear link to the health and well-being of people. But the other is the contribution for achieving this transformative change that we need for biodiversity. And I think this is like a research area that we really like and that we work with in our research group. And this is actually what I'm going to present today. Two studies, different studies that are trying to depict how nature connectedness, either measured as values or as orientations, can actually be positively linked to pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. I'm going to start with by presenting this paper in here that we published some years ago. This was part of my PhD. And here we were very, very interested in looking what were the underlying factors or causes explaining people's engagement in wildlife-friendly gardening in private domestic gardens in Denmark. I mean, we know that private domestic gardens, perhaps not in Denmark, I think here in the Copenhagen metropolitan region, they account for roughly 10% of the total green and blue infrastructure of the area. But we know that these percentages are way higher in other parts of the world, such as the UK and New Zealand. But we know that these privately owned green spaces actually can hold very important and huge potential for biodiversity conservation. They are increasingly recognized not only by academics, but also from strategic plans from the cities and regions. We know that, for example, city of Copenhagen is now trying to tap into this potential by giving money away to private owners to improve their gardens for biodiversity. But the biggest issue that governments have is that these are, of course, privately owned. And so we rely on voluntary engagement by these many different types of stakeholders that we have. And we rely on their voluntary engagement to really tap on the potential of these privately owned green spaces for advancing biodiversity protection, right? That's exactly why we conduct this study. Talking about wildlife-friendly domestic garden as opposed to conventional gardening, this is a type of gardening that can be actually understood as a pro-environmental behavior because it's trying to address the causes of impoverishment of the environment and trying to kind of restore the natural dynamics, but also the habitat quality for biodiversity, as opposed to conventional gardening, which focuses on like high maintenance and high input of resources and chemicals, right? So we understand here wildlife friendly gardening as a pro-environmental behavior or pro-biodiversity behavior, oftentimes also referred to as. And that's exactly what we want to do. We take departure on this model from Kolmus and Ehman. It's quite old, but we really like it because this was created to summarize the different pro-environmental behavior theories or theories on pro-environmental behavior. There are many different theories, and we really like this model, and I'm not going to speak much into it, because it kind of summarized the different things from each model into three main types of factors that they thought or they hypothesized that influenced engagement in pro-environmental behavior. The first is internal. This would be the values, level of awareness, and motivations. The second would be external, such as have to do with resources and infrastructure, as well as social norms around the individual or embedded in society. And the third would refer to the more social demographic characteristics of a person. And we basically use that as a theoretical framework to study these factors influencing people's gardening behaviors. Now, so the aim of this study was twofold. First and foremost, again, understand how these internal, external, and social demographic factors influenced people's engagement in wildlife-friendly gardening. And then the second, in purple here, we were also trying to contextualize that in this social-ecological domestic garden system. So trying to depart from this environmental psychology really approach to a more relational approach that also accounted for not only individuals, but their connections to their living environment and other people around them, right? So as you can see, green and purple, this directly links to the two different stages, methodological stages that we followed in this study. The first one, the green one, being more quantitative, using an online survey, and the second one being more qualitative, using walking interviews with private garden owners. Okay, so from a more quantitative side, we had this online survey that we distributed to different Facebook groups and also to different areas in Copenhagen. And in this survey, we were basically asking people, hey, what are you doing in your garden, right? We basically collected from the literature 19 wildlife-friendly gardening components that we thought were important, and we asked them whether they were doing this or this component was present in their garden or not. Then we also asked people about their perceived barriers to engage in wildlife-friendly gardening. And importantly, we also asked people's pro-environmental orientations or pro-environmental value orientations. And this, I think, is super interesting because it really links directly to what Anton was talking about, right? And like human-nature connections and how that can cascade or not into pro-environmental behavior and attitudes, right? I'm gonna then we also, of course, ask more information about the people per se, but also their gardens, how big their gardens were and what type of gardens these were. How do we operationalize this green, highlighted green component of the survey, which is pro-environmental orientations? We basically used the new ecological paradigm or new environmental paradigm. We took departure on this study from Dunlap, where they were revising an old scale. I think it was developed at the end of the 20th century. And this, I'm not going to go into much detail, but basically what this measures is whether people are inclined towards ecocentric or anthropocentric worldviews, right? We use a total of 15 items, and we ask people to basically agree or disagree with these items. And then what we do is we aggregate these items into what we call the NEP scale. The higher the scale, the more ecocentric the person, right? And as you can see here on the right part of the screen, you have different. We can see different types of these statements that we had. Some of them related to ecocentric views, and others related to anthropocentric views, right? To basically see what were the worldviews of these people that we were surveying, right? Yeah. As I was saying, we collected these internal, external, and social demographic factors, and then we put everything into a blender. But before that, I think it's important to to go through the more descriptive results. Not going to go into details here. On the right, we see the people that replied to the survey. We see that the biggest cities are represented. And of course, we had lower participation in rural areas. And we also see that not all the wildlife-friendly gardening components that we asked for were equally present to people's gardens. We see that those components requiring less effort and space were more common, whereas those requiring bigger landscape interventions were less common, obviously, as we were expecting. Now, let's go to the blender. We put all these internal, external, and social demographic factors into the blender. This blender is a multiple linear regression model. And we do that to basically try to see how these internal, external, and social demographic factors can actually explain people's engagement in wildlife-friendly gardening. In more technical terms, we take the wildlife-friendly gardening index as the outcome variable, and then all these factors as explanatory variables. And this is the craziness that we obtained from that blender. Many different things we see here, for example, that some socio-demographic information, such as the fact that retired people were actually having less wildlife-friendly gardening components in their gardens, but also some external factors and physical characteristics of the garden, such as, for example, the area of the garden, or how big the garden was positively correlated with the presence of wildlife-friendly gardening components. But more importantly for this talk today, we see that the new ecological paradigm score, again, these pro-environmental orientations, were actually positively correlated with the amount of wildlife-friendly gardening components that people had in their gardens, which is kind of showing us that people's orientations, people's worldviews actually mattered on what they were doing, mattered for what they were doing in their private domestic gardens. I'm not going to speak much into the second, the more qualitative leg of the study. But we were also interested, again, in understanding how people were taking decisions in their gardens. And among many of the barriers that we observe, or the enablers that we observed through these walking interviews, we saw that people's relationships to other people really mattered. And we took this relational values theory to basically understand how relational values for nature, but most importantly, relational values between people mediated by nature, really mattered in what people were, in explaining what people were doing in this in their gardens, right? We saw that relational values between people actually were even more important than people's hold values, people's internal values, right? I mean, we see, for example, that these people living in, as in case study 4, these were a group of people that were living in this shared house, and they said that because there was a local committee who decided what was pretty and what wasn't pretty, then they had to abide for those norms, even though they were against these norms, right? Which is showing that social norms in this case, again, wanting to maintain good relationships with other people really mattered more than what these people were internally holding or the value orientations of these people, which I think is a very interesting nuance. Now, what do we take from this tale? Yeah, of course, that certain factors such as the size of the garden and other internal and external factors matter for what people are doing in their private domestic gardens. Super important specifically for this talk to see this nice positive link between people's pro-environmental value orientations and wildlife-friendly gardening behaviors, so pro-biodiversity behaviors. And third, that gardening and wildlife-friendly gardening cannot be understood in isolation. It needs to be understood as a relational practice that mediates relational values for nature, but most importantly, relational values between people mediated by nature. Yeah, and at the end, we basically conclude that engaging or not in wildlife-friendly gardening emerged from the result of navigating your own value system, right? These orientations, the social expectations, as well as other physical and external conditions and constraints. All right, that was the first tale. And now we're moving to a second tale. Here is a different thing, right? We're going to be talking about the relationship between childhood nature experiences, broad human values, and people's pro-biodiversity attitudes, right? A bit of context, we're in Denmark, and we are going to see, as in many other European countries, huge landscape transformations. And these are what we call ecologically motivated landscape transformations, driven either by transnational agreements and regulations, such as the new nature restoration regulation, or national agreements, right? We're going to be seeing afforestation in Denmark, transformation of low-lying areas into wetlands, and many other stuff happening not only in rural landscapes, but also in urban areas. In this study, we are very interested in understanding what are the public opinions, what's the level of social acceptance, what do people think, and how do people perceive these upcoming transformations, landscape transformations. And most importantly, we are super interested in understanding some of these psychometric variables that we have already worked with, such as broad human values, so guiding principles that people have to make decisions, right? But also people's access and people's contact with nature during their childhood. And here we can see in this diagram some of the hypotheses that we're trying to test here in this study. We first and foremost want to understand what is the relationship between childhood nature experiences and how that influences, or how is that associated with broad human values that people hold in their adulthood. And at the same time, how this value system that people hold during adulthood relates to their attitudes toward, in this case, nature restoration measures, what we call in this study also pro-biodiversity attitudes. And of course, as well, whether there exists a direct link between childhood nature experiences and attitudes toward nature restoration measures. How do we do this? I think we actually haven't talked much about it, Anton, but this is our one of the main methods that we use in our research, which is public participatory GIS. This is an online survey that allows people to map also different stuff. So here people can basically especially locate or especially reference qualitative and quantitative data. And this is one of the methods that we use in our research. Now, we sent this survey to 35,000 people in the Copenhagen metropolitan region, right here in Denmark. And we asked people in this survey, hey, can you please map a familiar place in nature, a place in nature that you know of? Once people have mapped this place in nature, we also ask them, hey, what is the most predominant ecosystem type that we find in this place? And people could choose between these 5 different ecosystem types: urban green, forest, freshwater, bodies and systems, fields, which includes agricultural fields, but also open ecosystems such as heathlands and pastures, and also the coast and the sea, right? And we did that because we basically were then asking people their level of agreement with what I was talking about before, these nature restoration measures. We tailor-made 3 to 4 nature restoration measure statements to which people had to agree or disagree. And we use that in a way to assess the social acceptance, people's support for these nature restoration measures that will come in the Danish landscape in the near future, hopefully, right? So people, once they have mapped this place, they were also asked what they thought about these potentially upcoming hypothetical nature restoration measures as a way of measuring these pro-biodiversity attitudes. That allowed us to basically identify what are low-hanging fruits, what are ecosystem types that might be more readily acceptable for people, where these nature restoration measures will receive lower levels of acceptance. And we see, for example, that forest and urban ecosystems were those that received lower levels of acceptance as opposed to freshwater, coast, and field ecosystems, which is very interesting from a management perspective. We also, because of the, and I'm not going to go into details, but because of the especially explicit nature of the survey, we could also, in the case study area, highlight and identify areas where acceptance was higher or acceptance was lower, right? But to the interesting part of this study for this talk is how we operationalize these broad human values. Again, we were, when introducing this tale, we were saying that we were really interested in measuring how broad human values related to acceptance. So in a way, we had to operationalize. We had to know what we would be asking people to reply to in the survey. So what we did after a long time researching how other people were doing it, we stumbled upon, we found this human value scale report, and we learned about this European social survey. In this European social survey, they had this module that they repeat every year with the portrait value scale. And this is used to basically assess people, the degree to which people could relate to different attitudes or to different points of view about different stuff, right? Of course, this European social survey taps into many different types of values, but we selected only 3 broad value typologies, which were egoistic, altruistic, and biocentric value orientations. And we selected these 3 ones because these are the most important ones to explain pro-environmental value and as a pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors, right? So what we did is to ask people, first of all, we were giving them these different types of statements or items that you see here, and we were asking them the degree to which they related to these attitudes or to these worldviews, right? And in that way, they could say that this person was very much like me or not like me at all, right? And then we could know what the orientations were for these different types of values. And one aspect also that we were asking people, which was very important to test our hypothesis, was people's experience of nature during their childhood. And we took departure from this study in here, and we asked people the frequency and diversity of nature experiences during their childhood, specifically between the years, between 6 and 11 years of age. Now, with all of that, we ran different models that I'm not going into details, but we first want to assess the relationship between broad value orientations and acceptance for these nature restoration measures. And we find something very, very interesting here. We see, for example, in this case, we're testing diversity of childhood nature experiences and biocentric, altruistic, and egoistic value orientations. Very interestingly, we see that for both, also for people that were exposed to more than 15 types of nature experiences during childhood, we already see significantly higher biocentric and altruistic value orientations, which is basically telling us that higher exposure to a more diverse set of nature experiences during childhood might lead, or at least is positively correlated with biocentric and altruistic value orientations during adulthood. Now, these relationships we do not find with egoistic value orientations. which is basically trying to tell us that perhaps nature experiences during childhood doesn't really matter for the egoistic value orientations that people hold in adulthood. The same happens, but to a lower extent, with the frequency in which people were exposed to nature during their childhoods. Yeah, we see that this is also positively correlated. So more frequent visits to nature during childhood, more positive or more biocentric and altruistic value orientations that people have during adulthood, and inconclusive results for egoistic value orientations. Now, very interestingly also, we see, of course, a positive correlation between altruistic, as we were expecting, between altruistic and biocentric value orientations and people's acceptance for nature restoration measures, meaning that we are here proving a link between people's broad values and their attitudes toward pro-biodiversity measures, right? In this case, nature restoration measures. And we do not find a correlation, a significant correlation with egoistic value orientations. Lastly, we also want to look at whether there exists a direct link between diversity of childhood nature experiences and acceptance for nature restoration. And though we see that for both cases, frequency and diversity, there's some positive trends. So we see that the more diverse and the more frequent these childhood nature experiences during childhood, the more increase in diversity and frequency linked to higher levels of acceptance for nature restoration, but these are not statistically significant, meaning that there's something obscuring the relationship here between exposure to nature during childhood and attitudes for nature restoration in adulthood. Now, what are the take-home messages from this second tale? Well, first, we haven't gone into the descriptives of this study, but we actually find surprisingly strong altruistic and biocentric value orientations and weak egocentric or egoistic value orientations, which is kind of funny because we need to understand that most of our respondents actually lived in cities. So this also opens a conversation about, is it really people living in cities? Are people living in cities pro-environmentally oriented? Well, that's something that we should look into in the future. The second is that there are indeed positive associations between both the diversity and frequency of childhood nature experiences and altruistic as well as biocentric value orientations in adulthood, meaning that, of course, we cannot assume causality here, but perhaps if we provide diverse environments, because we saw that diversity of childhood nature experiences was actually more important than frequency in predicting attitudes, right? So can we work with the environments to which children are playing and to which children are exposed in cities? And perhaps we will be able to change their value orientations in their adulthood, right? And then have positive effects for transformative change for biodiversity. And then the third take-home message here is that increases in biocentric and altruistic value scores led to higher acceptance for nature restoration measures. So again, we basically confirm the link between broad values and people's attitudes toward biodiversity in this case. And then the fourth and final take-home message is actually the link between childhood nature experiences and social acceptance for nature restoration. So attitudes for pro-biodiversity measures is kind of obscured and it's not so evident, meaning that there might be other stuff happening in between blocking this flow, this theoretical flow or hypothetical flow that we would expect. We could talk about aspects of place protective action, place attachment, and other stuff here. But I think this is all I had to say.
And yeah, and that brings us to the very final slide of this talk. We hope that you got a little bit of insight into some of the research that we're doing here in our group, where we try to tap into this sustainable vision here, understanding some of the links between our contact with nature, our nature connectedness, and how that might also explain then norms, values, and behaviors for attitudes. This afternoon, we have not talked so much about the instrumental vision, but that's actually also research we're doing into the more kind of, what can we say, dark sides of nature experiences, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I think the floor is open now for questions, right?
Yeah, we would like to thank everyone.
Yes. Thanks a lot for listening in.
And for inviting us to give this talk.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was so exciting and so much going on. And so, I think hopefully there's lots of questions. I've got a lot of questions. So please write your questions in the chat. I saw that there's a few that have come up here. Let me see. There's lots going on in the chat here. Here we have one. Is it interesting facts? Have you noticed any risk of backlash that nature-friendly persons adapt and drive development towards more engagement in biodiversity? As the EU 2030 call for 20% restoration areas, how can we wisely work for a positive adaptation? Children are key. What about adults? That was a long question.
Yeah, maybe I can start. I mean, it's very interesting because we will see, as I was saying, we will see big landscape transformations coming in Europe. And unfortunately, we see that most of these decisions are still taking very top-down, and they have a very technocratic and expert view. And oftentimes we see how the social dimensions of creating new nature, for example, as we will see here in Denmark, creating new forests, is oftentimes overlooked. And I think that these kind of studies in this kind of projects, actually, what they're trying to say is like, hey, do not miss the opportunities also emerging from reconnecting people and nature through these interventions that you're doing. So we think that there's huge potential behind taking into consideration how people will relate to the landscapes, what people will experience in these new landscapes that we will see, to foster and catalyze these pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors that will have effect in many other directions and that in many other skills, right?
Yeah, it's involving people from the start, really, that you're in these that being a part of something, feeling that you're being a part of something as well.
Yeah, and I think that's also very important in this time that we're living in, that where people also increasingly feel apathy and depression and around the lack of speed of transformations and the seriousness of what we're looking into, and to also have and here I think actually that actions and agency are super important. How can we provide people with some agency, and also know that a lot of the botanical gardens are involving people in different types of activities. I think this feeling of agency is very important, also to help us pretty much. And here, in particular, the wildlife-friendly gardening example is perhaps really strong and good, because this is something, I mean, a lot of people actually, also in cities, have access to private gardens or shared gardens or courtyard environments or different kind of things, where you actually can maybe get this feeling of agency that we know is one of the pathways to an increased nature connection. So there is something here that is also interesting. Yeah.
It's like everybody can do something little to make an effect, and it does really give you hope if you feel that it's not that everyone can be involved in some little way. Another question here is, a recent article showed that there was a number, this was from Sweden, a number of people who experience negative emotions towards, a growing number of people who really experience negative emotions towards nature. Is that something that you think about as well in your research, or have you thought about solutions or what's needed here? I was thinking maybe that's what you've just said about the small gardening and getting people engaged, but I thought it was quite surprising.
But it is also true that we are seeing in a lot of our both different types of value survey and nature visitation survey, we see also still a very small segment of the population locally, but actually also maybe a little bit of a growing segment of the population that actually don't care. I would not say that necessarily will feel disconnected, because that's a negative feeling. I would just say that they are distant. They don't care pretty much. And that's, of course, something we also have to be very clear about and research more into. I think this distance from nature trend that is also happening. But according to all the numbers that I've seen, it is still a very small proportion of the population in cities and in general that are, but it's unfortunately also growing. So, yeah.
Let me see, there's another question here. Thank you for an interesting lecture. Have you or any other researchers started to look into how this research can be incorporated in the school's curriculum to give children nature experiences and hope to give them a positive attitude towards nature and nature restoration?
I could not agree more. We have good, strong colleagues that are working with environmental education, also in research, clearly, in Sweden and in Denmark. And I know there's a lot of work going on right now in actually looking into that. And here the schools and after school and all these kind of formal institutions are super central and important, no doubt about it. And in particular, when we're talking about children's nature experiences. And I think we're also seeing, unfortunately, numbers here that are also a little bit problematic. There's different researchers that have looked into free range of children that have diminished a lot over only a few generations. So the opportunities to free range as a child and have, just run out in nature and explore has actually diminished over a very, very short time period. And that's both something to do with, I suppose, adulthood, but perhaps also partly about our schooling and how we are, working with that. But I mean, us here from the universities, we are, of course, welcoming collaboration with everybody. But I would also say that we are trying to focus on the research part. And we really hope that others, teachers and educational researchers will take up that challenge for sure and bridge that border, that gap, because it is indeed very, very important.
Yeah, it does feel important. We have another question on the same subject, how to integrate the research findings in educational practice and the curriculum in Danish schools, and that the lock-in effect is developing today, not only in Scandinavia, but also all over the world, that children, I think this is meaning that children aren't doing out in the field or outside with schoolwork. But I think you just touched on that as well. The next, we have one last question here, or maybe not a question, but a statement that the biophobia and the biophilia hypothesis is also in this area of research. I think that was a little bit about the article as well that came up with the biophobia.
Yes, indeed. And that is, of course, something also that is interesting. We don't have that terrible many, historical studies to look into to see look for trends. But of course, there's a lot of things being discussed at the moment, also in relation to rewilding initiatives. That, of course, are interesting because, at least in Denmark, I don't think we're used to nature being something that can harm us. Maybe if there's a big storm or something, or you can drown in the sea. But besides that, it's a bit new that we're also seeing this kind of biophobia. People being afraid to walk into grass because of ticks, or but also people being afraid from the wolf that have naturally migrated to Denmark, and all these kind of things. And that's a very, very interesting dynamics that we have to understand better in these also rewilding times we're looking into, I think.
Yeah, and also not to mention the effects of climate change as well. and how that can play in connecting or mostly disconnecting, I would say, people from nature. I mean, hydrological extremes, severe droughts and forest fires, and I mean, all of this will, of course, it's a huge challenge, right, that we're facing. Yeah,
it definitely is.
And then here we really have to embrace the disservices with renaturing and nature. We have to understand these, and I think we have to be better also maybe at articulating them. We have to take them seriously also. All these trade-offs that comes with nature in a city, and also with a more wild and dangerous nature. And that's a mindset we have to work with here, in my view. That is super important and central.
Yeah, I think when you said that, the mindset and the tick thing, because this is what I hear as well a lot, is people don't cut they want the grass cut because of ticks, and it is changing, having the cut lawns and the perfect edges and letting the grass grow up and the flower instead. So yeah. One more, the Danish Ranger Association, Naturvårdsforening, is still strong and popular. Many teachers are asking for more knowledge about biodiversity, activities that increase biodiversity near schools. So that's interesting. We have a couple more here. We've just got a few minutes. The relational part to other humans of the adaptation to interest in nature was very interesting. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Is it just showing that humans are a group and collective directed as a species?
Yeah, basically, yes. So I think what we wanted to do with this relational angle to this study was to basically move a bit beyond classic environmental psychology views and to approach gardening in this case as a relational practice, right? And I mean, when we talk about relational values, these are relational. We say that gardening can be a way of manifesting relational values for nature. In other words, how people think they have to relate to nature, right? And you can do that through gardening. If you think you have to relate to nature in this way, then you will garden in this way. If you think you need to control nature, then you will also garden in another way. But what we actually found is that individual relational values for nature were sometimes even not prioritized when managing their gardens, because we found that relational values between people mediated by nature, that is, how other people expect you to relate to nature, were actually more important in predicting what people were doing. So yes, it's basically acknowledging that we're part of a social-ecological system. We're not alone, and sometimes we put priorities in like maintaining good relationships and nurturing relational values between people mediated by nature than our own internal relational values for nature. And that was very clear in our study.
And in general, I would also say here, maybe if I may, that of course this is not something new as such. I mean, social psychology have looked a lot into that and how critical norms are to our behavior, and what is the how many should change the norm before we change the societal norm. And we are indeed living in a norm-based society in many ways that are dictating all our behaviors, not even that we think about it, right? And all the time. And I would also say that it's something that is very close to these kind of more psychometric recent choice modeling. So that looked into theory of planned behavior and these things where subjective norms and social norms are super important, and often the most important factor in explaining people's behavior. And we have also seen that in other studies when trying to understand I think this was a study from Norway looking into local landowners' willingness to join a tree planting campaign around a water catchment area or something like that. And here actually the social norm was one of the most important, explaining if they wanted to join or not this program. So what their neighbor did, the neighboring landowner or their family, or what the opinions of their friends are actually more important than a lot of other things you could think of. So yes, we are indeed a social collective group oriented species, or And we have to take that very seriously when we work with these questions, I think. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. One last, not a question, but it's Anders Szczepanski wrote, the Scottish Parliament take a law before Christmas that pupils and teachers are allowed to use the outdoors in learning and teaching. It's the first country in the world, apparently. So which is wonderful. So nice ending to our talk here.
Yes.
And if they can do it up there, we can do it everywhere, right? Because it's not the best weather or climate.
Exactly. I would like to say thank you so much, Anton and Oriol, and to everybody who's been participating today. And next week will be Yannick Verstraete from the regional landscape Houtland and Polders in Belgium, who will talk about the importance of native plants and gardens in restoring insect populations. So this will tie perfectly into your talk, Anton and Oriol, because Yannick is who works as a practitioner and an expert with wildflowers and insects. So he'll be talking about gardening, which will tie perfectly in here. So if you'd like to register, if you want to attend this webinar, please register. And as you probably know, all the webinars are recorded. The first one that was from last week, will soon be available on the Interreg webpage. And after the webinar series is completed, you will receive an email with a questionnaire on reflections and learnings. We'd greatly appreciate if you could fill this in. You can still use the chat for another few minutes if you have any remaining thoughts to share, and we will check it afterwards. But on behalf of the entire EXPBIO team, I would like to thank you all for participating, and we hope to see you again at the next webinar. Bye.
Thank you very much.